December 8, 1942, Rabaul, New Britain. Rain lashes the tin roofs of the 17th Army headquarters. Crates are dragged into a dim room lit by a single kerosene lamp. Inside the boxes, not rifles or rations, but paper, binders, notebooks and handbooks stamped U.S. Army Infantry School, Fort Benning, Georgia. The crates came from Guadalcanal. Japanese troops of the 2nd Division had seized them from a wrecked American supply dump near the Matanico River. What they found inside startled even the staff officers. The documents were training manuals, covering squad movement, platoon-level fire coordination, and combined arms assault procedures. Major General Harakichi Hyakutake ordered immediate analysis. A small cell from the Army Staff College in Tokyo, led by Lieutenant Colonel Sadanobu Okada, was flown in aboard a Type 97 Sally bomber converted for transport. Their mission: extract tactical intelligence page by page. By mid-December, translation began. The manuals were systematic, almost industrial, in their logic. Charts detailed rate of advance under machine gun fire, communication protocols between rifle and mortar platoons, and even psychological conditioning for soldiers. To the Japanese officers it was alien. The Americans treated war like engineering. One manual drew particular attention: Infantry Company in the Attack. It broke combat down into numerical steps: frontage width, fire support intervals, ammunition consumption per minute. It is like a production line, Okada wrote in his summary. They teach a private to think in procedures, not spirit. The Japanese analysts realized these were not high-level plans. They were operational algorithms, manuals that told a corporal exactly when to crawl, when to fire, when to radio. And behind them lay something the Imperial Army lacked: infrastructure. Radios in every squad. Jeeps for every platoon. Continuous aerial reconnaissance. By January 1943, the reports had reached Tokyo. At the Army General Staff, Lieutenant General Torishiro Kawabe convened a closed session in the War Ministry building. Intelligence officers presented the findings under the title, Study on the Enemy's Tactical Doctrine. Their conclusion was blunt. American operations emphasize cooperation of branches, material superiority, and constant supply. Ours rely on courage, endurance, and decentralized fighting spirit. Without equivalent technical and logistical systems, imitation is impossible. That sentence would echo through every Japanese staff school for the rest of the war. The manuals were evidence of a deeper divide: doctrine versus design. The U.S. Army's tactics were not born of tradition. They were manufactured, tested, and optimized. Fort Benning's instructors built training programs on live-fire ranges with stopwatches and film cameras. Every maneuver was measured for efficiency. Japanese doctrine, refined from the Russo-Japanese War and Manchurian campaigns, prized the offensive spirit, Seishin, over material coordination. In China it worked. Against the U.S. Army and Marine Corps, armed with radios, automatic weapons, and aerial spotting, it became fatal. In February 1943, a captured Marine lieutenant near Gifu on Guadalcanal revealed that his company had practiced simulated night attacks under live tracer fire, 12 weeks of field drills before deployment. The Japanese, by contrast, sent conscripts to the front after 3 weeks of bayonet practice and marching. Okada's final memorandum to the War Ministry ran 46 pages. It ended with a line that unsettled his superiors. The enemy soldier is not superior in spirit, but he fights as part of a machine designed to sustain him. Our soldier fights alone. The manuals were copied and circulated across the Guangdong Army, the 8th Area Army, and Naval Intelligence Bureaus in Truk in Saipan. Yet little changed. Japan's logistics network was stretched across 4,000 miles of ocean. Its factories could not mass-produce field radios or half-tracks. So the documents became both revelation and indictment, proof of what could not be replicated. By mid-1943, while the Americans rewired their doctrine into unstoppable firepower at Tarawa and Bougainville, Japanese officers still lectured recruits on Bushido and bayonet charges. The manuals lay in drawers stamped top secret, for reference only. What began as a translation project had exposed a truth no officer wanted to face. The United States had turned warfare into an industry. Japan had turned it into a religion. March 5, 1943, Tokyo, Army Staff College, Ichigaya. The lecture hall smelled of chalk and tobacco. On the blackboard, white kanji letters spelled out a phrase that silenced the officers. Enemy training philosophy: efficiency through material coordination. Lieutenant Colonel Sadanobu Okada stood at the lectern, pointer in hand. Before him sat 60 mid-career officers, battalion and regimental commanders from Burma, New Guinea and China, summoned for a week of doctrinal review. Most had fought since 1937. They believed in Seishin, the spirit of attack. Okada opened a captured U.S. Army manual and read aloud. Every soldier is a technician in the employment of firepower. He let the words hang. A murmur moved through the room. Then he unrolled a diagram. A U.S. infantry platoon advancing with M1 Garand and bars under covering fire from a 60mm mortar squad. The key point wasn't the weapons, it was the timing. Each movement was clocked to seconds, synchronized by radio. "Observe," Okada said, tapping the chart. "They train for precision. We train for courage." Major Takeshi Kyum, recently returned from the Kokoda campaign, interrupted. "Sir, courage wins battles. Spirit overcomes machines." Okada paused. "Spirit cannot repair a broken field phone." The room went still. That exchange captured the fracture line inside Japan's war machine. On one side, the modernizers, officers who had seen American logistics firsthand. On the other, the traditionalists steeped in Bushido who viewed reliance on machinery as moral decay. The following month, Okada's team submitted their expanded analysis, Report Number 47, on the enemy's combat organization. It contained data distilled from 3 U.S. sources. FM 7-10, Rifle Company, Rifle Regiment, 1942. FM 7-15, Heavy Weapons Company, Infantry Regiment. FM 100-5, Field Service Regulations. They summarized how a single American infantry division of 15,000 men could coordinate 105mm howitzers, Sherman tanks, and air support within 15 minutes of contact. Japanese divisions of similar size lacked integrated artillery communication and carried less than 1/3 the ammunition per soldier. Charts compared rations, medical evacuation times, and even field sanitation, areas the Japanese dismissed as rear concerns. The data was damning. A wounded American could reach a field hospital in 4 to 6 hours. A wounded Japanese might die in 2 days without morphine or transfusion. By mid-1943, the Army Staff College published an internal circular, Confidential Lesson 231, Tactics of the United States Army. It was not distributed widely. Only staff officers and instructors could access it. In the preface, the General Staff inserted a disclaimer. While studying foreign systems, we must not lose our national character. Mechanical imitation leads to moral decline. The disclaimer nullified the document's power. At the front, nothing changed. August 1943, New Guinea. At Salamaua, Major General Hidemitsu Nakano's 51st Division faced the Australian 3rd Division and the U.S. 162nd Infantry Regiment. The Japanese attacked through swamp and Kenai grass. The enemy responded with timed artillery concentrations, called by forward observers through SEER 536 handy-talkie radios. Japanese troops advanced in waves, shouting "Banzai." They were cut down before reaching 100 yards. After the battle, a captured Japanese report from Nakano's staff read, "Enemy fires are guided by unseen control. Their shells land as if directed by a god." It was radio science, not divinity. Meanwhile, at Fort Benning, Georgia, the U.S. Army expanded its infantry school to 120 instructors and began using motion picture training, real projectors simulating live engagements. By October 1943, over 200,000 American soldiers had completed standardized tactical courses. The Japanese still relied on oral instruction and rote drill. The disparity deepened. Back in Tokyo, Okada privately urged the Army Education Bureau to adopt a modular training program using visual diagrams and mechanical aids. His memo was ignored. Instead, the Bureau issued a circular emphasizing moral training and spiritual preparation. By 1944, Japan's doctrine remained trapped in pre-industrial rhythm, bravery against mechanization, instinct against system. But even traditionalists could not ignore the mounting evidence. As carrier raids shattered truck and B-29s reached Saipan, the manuals re-emerged in intelligence briefings. Officers began whispering a forbidden conclusion. The Americans fight as if they already know the outcome. Because, in a way they did, their training had turned probability into practice. Okada's prophecy from Rabaul now haunted every front. The enemy soldier was not alone. He was the smallest part of a vast, coordinated organism. July 8, 1944, Saipan, Mariana Islands. The 31st Army headquarters lay in ruins. Shell craters pocked the coral plain. From a burned-out command truck, a Japanese staff officer pulled a rectangular metal object, olive drab, dented but intact. Stenciled letters read, SR-300. It was a U.S. Army backpack radio. Within 48 hours, a signal unit under Captain Kiyoshi Morimoto had disassembled it. The components shocked him: vacuum tubes, frequency crystals, waterproof casing, and a compact dry cell battery pack. Range, nearly 10 miles. Weight, 38 pounds. Morimoto compared it to Japan's standard-issue Type 94 field phone, a 50-pound crank model requiring line wire and manual switchboards. On Saipan's terrain, his operators could not move it more than 300 yards under fire. The SR-300 let an American lieutenant talk directly to artillery. For the Japanese, that changed everything. On July 9, as U.S. Marines of the 2nd Division pushed north, fire missions landed with mechanical precision. Each salvo corrected within seconds. Japanese positions, concealed in caves and ridge lines, were neutralized before counterattack. From the high ground, observers could see how coordination worked. Squads pinned down, officers crouched over radios, hand signals matched to artillery bursts. It was choreography. Their radio speaks faster than our messengers can run, Morimoto noted in his report. Captured equipment flooded Tokyo's technical bureau that autumn: AM-1 carbines, bazookas, .50 cal machine guns, and standardized field gear stamped with U.S. quartermaster codes. Each item revealed the same truth: industrial synchronization. The United States did not field individual weapons, it fielded systems. September 15, 1944, Leyte Gulf. American landing forces executed Operation King II. Nearly 700 ships, 174,000 troops, and 300 landing craft assaulted the beaches. The Japanese 35th Army, commanded by Lieutenant General Sosaku Suzuki, intercepted the invasion order too late. Their counterattack was brave and doomed. Coordination between the U.S. Navy, Army, and Air Force turned the landing into a textbook display of joint warfare. Each wave of Higgins boats advanced under timed naval gunfire from destroyers and cruisers. Close air support arrived within 3 minutes of radio call. A Japanese regimental commander recorded his observation near Dulag. The enemy's landing rhythm is like the operation of a great machine. No confusion, no pause. They move as one mind. When Japanese staff officers later examined U.S. documents recovered from a crashed C-47 on Leyte, they found pre-printed coordination tables listing artillery fire intervals, air sortie timing, and beach traffic flow rates. The planning math was exact: 40 rounds per gun per minute for 10 minutes, 1,200 vehicles offloaded per hour. No Japanese division possessed such a timetable. Back in Tokyo, Colonel Okada received a field crate marked Captured Materials, Saipan/Leyte. Inside, a U.S. Army Training Circular TC 7-5, Small Unit Operations. It illustrated the fusion between man and machine, radio nets mapped down to the platoon, with frequency assignments, code words, and chain of command redundancy. Okada underlined one phrase in red pencil: no movement without communication, no fire without observation. He wrote in the margin, "We have courage. They have control." In December 1944, the Imperial Army convened a classified symposium, Study Number 127, Countermeasures to Mechanized Coordination. Representatives from 10th Area Army, the Navy's Combined Fleet, and the Army Aeronautical Department attended. They concluded, Japan could not duplicate the American system without total industrial reorganization. Radios required copper, batteries, and crystal production Japan could not sustain under blockade. Instead, the conference produced a desperate order: train soldiers to fight without support, autonomous, self-sufficient squads. The very opposite of what the manuals had proven effective. Meanwhile, American doctrine tightened even further. At Fort Benning, every rifle platoon drilled with radio-controlled dummy artillery and aerial spotting by Piper L-4 Grasshopper planes. By the time they reached Okinawa, U.S. units could coordinate combined arms fire within 90 seconds of enemy contact. Okada's final wartime note, dated January 3, 1945, read, "The enemy has fused technology with discipline. We have discipline without technology. This imbalance will decide the war." He was right. When Saipan fell, Japan lost not just a fortress, but proof that individual bravery could no longer compensate for systemic inferiority. The U.S. Army had turned the battlefield into an algorithm. February 10, 1945, Tokyo, Army Ministry Archives, Ichigaya. Paper dust floated in the dim light as clerks stacked hundreds of captured American documents. Labels in black ink read, Saipan, Leyte, Guadalcanal, Tactical Materials. The files were bound in brown cord, stamped Confidential, Intelligence Division, 2nd Bureau. Lieutenant Colonel Sadanobu Okada watched in silence. He had spent 3 years dissecting the enemy system, their manuals, radios, and coordination charts. Now, in the last winter of the war, his analysis filled more shelves than ammunition crates. The Army General Staff ordered a comprehensive synthesis, report on the tactical characteristics of the U.S. Army. 36 officers worked around the clock, compiling notes from every front, from New Guinea to Burma to the Philippines. They compared every weapon, every drill, every pattern of movement. The final report, completed on March 3, 1945, ran 1,426 pages. Its structure was clinical, almost scientific. Section 1. Organization of U.S. Infantry Division. Section 2. Combat Training and Psychological Conditioning. Section 3. Supply and Maintenance Systems. Section 4. Tactical Behavior Observed in the Pacific Theater. The findings were unambiguous. American infantry fights in coordinated layers, platoons, companies, and battalions interlocked by communication. Every unit is backed by measurable firepower, mortars, artillery, air cover, medical and logistical continuity. Their efficiency depends on mechanical dependability, vehicles, radios, and supply lines. The conclusion, signed by Major General Torishiro Kawabe, read, "Our forces cannot match this method under current industrial and resource conditions. We must accept that the enemy's strength lies not in individual superiority but in total integration." It was a rare admission, the most honest of the war. But outside the ministry walls, Tokyo burned. American B-29s had begun their low-level firebombing raids. The first came on March 9 to 10, 1945, when 279 bombers from the 73rd, 313th, and 314th Bomb Wings struck with M69 incendiaries. In 6 hours, 16 square miles of the city were ash and smoke. While Okada's analysts filed data on enemy efficiency, the Empire's supply network disintegrated. Trains stopped for lack of fuel. Factories ran at 30% capacity. The irony was brutal. Japan finally understood how the enemy fought, just as it lost the means to fight at all. Still, the studies continued. April 1945, Tachikawa Air Technical Depot. Captured U.S. equipment from the Philippines arrived by truck. An M4A1 Sherman engine, a Browning M2 receiver, and a crate of training films. Engineers projected the reels on a concrete wall. The films showed recruits drilling under live fire, instructors timing reaction speeds and synchronized mortar coordination. Japanese officers watched in silence. The footage looked like assembly line warfare, every soldier a moving part. At the same time, the Imperial Navy's Technical Department compiled Naval Study No. 34, American Amphibious Warfare Doctrine. Using intelligence from the Marianas and Iwo Jima, it documented the sequencing of naval bombardment, landing craft deployment, and aerial spotting. The report's assessment. Their operations unfold according to mathematical schedule. They land not by courage but by calculation. June 1945, Iwo Jima. When the U.S. Marines stormed the island, Japanese command bunkers intercepted American radio traffic for 72 hours before their lines were buried. The transcripts revealed disciplined brevity, Red 1 advancing, fire for effect grid 2789, adjust 100 left. There was no shouting, no confusion. It was language turned into logistics. Lieutenant General Tadamaki Kuribayashi, who had already studied the American system during his diplomatic posting in Washington years earlier, had warned Tokyo. Once the Americans bring their full coordination to bear, Japan cannot resist indefinitely. By July 1945, Okada's Intelligence Division produced its final wartime memorandum on the impossibility of sustained modern warfare without industrial equivalents. It concluded that Japan's tactical doctrine had reached its limit, not through failure of spirit but of structure. The last page read, "We have learned the enemy's logic too late. Knowledge without material is impotence." 2 weeks later, B-29s dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okada survived the war. He would later tell an Allied interviewer in 1946, "We studied your manuals. We admired their precision. But a manual is only as powerful as the factories behind it." For Japan's officer corps, that was the final revelation. Intelligence had outlived capability. Understanding the American war machine did not stop it. September 12, 1945, Yokohama, Kanagawa Prefecture. Rain fell on the docks as U.S. Army trucks rolled past silent Japanese soldiers. The war was over. But the study of it had just begun. Inside a commandeered schoolhouse near the waterfront, American officers from G2 Intelligence Section of General MacArthur's headquarters unpacked crates of captured Japanese military documents, more than 20,000 volumes. Among them, Report on the Tactical Characteristics of the U.S. Army, compiled 6 months earlier by Lieutenant Colonel Sadanobu Okada's division. Major Robert Cole, a language officer trained at Fort Snelling, read the cover sheet, smiled grimly, and marked it to be translated, Priority 1. What had begun as wartime espionage now became reverse analysis. The Americans wanted to know how the Japanese had viewed them, and what lessons the defeated army had drawn. Okada himself was summoned to Tokyo by occupation authorities on October 3, 1945. He arrived at the former Imperial Hotel, now the Civil Intelligence Section's headquarters, wearing a faded khaki uniform stripped of insignia. Interrogator Captain Edwin Reinecke asked one question. When did you first realize Japan couldn't win? Okada answered without pause. When we read your manuals. For 3 months, Okada and other former staff officers were debriefed. Their assessments astonished U.S. analysts. They had dissected American training methods in astonishing detail, platoon radio nets, supply chain velocity, even the psychological conditioning of recruits. One appendix in their March 1945 report correctly described how U.S. Army field kitchens rotated food logistics on a 5-day schedule to maintain calorie levels above 3,600 per soldier. The Americans concluded, the Japanese had understood how the U.S. fought, but could not become what they understood. 1946, Ichigaya, Tokyo. Under the occupation, Japan's General Staff College was disbanded. But MacArthur's administration, seeking stability, quietly encouraged a new kind of military scholarship, analytical, not ideological. Former officers, once forbidden even to wear uniforms, were hired as consultants to help Allied translators interpret Japanese wartime records. In a dusty classroom of the old college, a strange partnership formed. On one side, Okada and his peers, men who had once plotted Pacific offensives. On the other, American operations researchers, veterans of the Statistical Control Division and RAND's embryonic analysis groups. Their task, reassemble the data of war. The Americans brought IBM tabulators and punch card systems. Japanese analysts brought handwritten battle reports. Together, they reconstructed the logistical ratios of both armies: tonnage per soldier, transport radius per gallon of fuel, casualty rates per hour of contact. By early 1947, the joint studies produced the Operational History Series, a classified 120-volume project cataloging every major Japanese campaign. It was the first time Japanese officers confronted their own numbers and saw the mathematical inevitability of defeat. One table from the Philippines volume compared daily supply rates. U.S. 14 Corps, 42 tons per mile of advance. Japanese 35th Army, 1.7 tons. Another compared medical evacuation times. American wounded, 4.8 hours. Japanese wounded, 2.6 days. The numbers stripped the myth bare. The Imperial Army had fought heroically, but arithmetically doomed. 1948, Tokyo University of Science. Okada, now a civilian lecturer, gave a public talk titled, Technology and the Soldier. He stood before students too young to have fought, holding a single object, a US M1 helmet. During the war, he said, we thought this was a symbol of materialism. But it is a system, steel, logistics, and science protecting the man beneath. We had none of that. In the audience sat representatives from the newly forming National Police Reserve, the embryonic Japanese self-defense force. Many of its early officers had studied under Okada's generation. They took his words as doctrine. Under U.S. supervision, Japan's rearmament focused not on glory but on systems, communication networks, maintenance, and standardized procedure. The very things once dismissed as soulless became the foundation of a new defense ethos. By the time the self-defense forces were officially created in 1954, the manuals had returned, this time translated, studied, and accepted. The irony was complete. Japan's post-war army would be built not on Seishin, but on the manuals once captured, read, and rejected. Okada died in 1957. His final note, found among his papers, read, "We lost to an idea that war could be taught like engineering. The tragedy is that we learned it only after the machines stopped." May 12, 1952, Camp Zama, Kanagawa Prefecture. A brass band played softly under gray skies as the rising sun flag, without its wartime rays, rose beside the Stars and Stripes. Japan's National Police Reserve, now 75,000 strong, was officially placed under the newly created National Safety Agency. It was the quiet rebirth of a military force, shaped not by samurai ethos but by spreadsheets and training schedules. In a classroom at the camp's newly established Training Evaluation Division, a group of instructors studied a thick blue binder marked U.S. Army Field Manual, Infantry Training 1951. Among them sat Major Reserve Yoshio Tanemura, once an Imperial Army instructor at the Nakano School. 10 years earlier he had lectured on infiltration tactics and moral discipline. Now he was diagramming fire team coordination with colored chalk. On the blackboard, 4-man team, rifle, automatic rifle, grenadier, leader. The layout was identical to a diagram drawn at Fort Benning a decade earlier, the same doctrine Okada's team had analyzed at Rabaul in 1942. The irony was not lost on Tanemura. After Japan regained sovereignty under the San Francisco Peace Treaty in April 1952, U.S. advisors began reshaping its defense framework. Colonel Frank Kowalski, MacArthur's former logistics officer, led the reorganization. His principle was simple: Japan's new forces must never again depend on spirit alone. Every man would be trained, measured, and sustained by system. The Camp Zama curriculum project began that summer. Its centerpiece, a 180-day standardized basic course modeled after U.S. Army infantry training. Recruits studied ballistics, communications, and mechanical maintenance, subjects once dismissed as non-warrior. Each drill had data attached: rounds expended, accuracy rate, reaction time. To supervise progress, American instructors introduced statistical control. Monthly reports graphed performance curves, a practice borrowed directly from RAND's operational research. For the first time in Japanese military history, progress was not judged by morale or slogans, but by numbers. August 1953, Tokyo Defense Academy, Yokosuka. The academy opened its gates on reclaimed naval land overlooking Tokyo Bay. Its first dean, former Imperial Navy Captain Shigeyoshi Inoue, wrote the entrance motto: "Science as discipline. Duty as reason." Students studied physics, navigation, and organizational psychology. In the library, beside dusty Meiji-era volumes on Bushido, stood new shelves lined with translated American field manuals, FM 100-5, Field Service Regulations FM 7-10, Infantry Company in the Attack, and FM 21-75, Combat Skills of the Soldier. Inoue insisted cadets read them not as foreign texts, but as engineering blueprints. "Doctrine is a machine," he told them. "If you understand its parts, you can build your own." Behind the scenes, U.S. instructors from the Far East Command coordinated training standards. Every Japanese unit adopted lesson plans, the exact pedagogical format pioneered at Fort Benning. Even rifle ranges were redesigned according to American specifications: 200-, 300- and 500-meter lines, lateral safety berms, and timed pop-up targets. By 1954, the National Safety Force became the Japan Self-Defense Forces, JSDF. Their doctrine manual, Basic Combat Principles, Volume 1, borrowed language directly from US FM 100-5 but added a uniquely Japanese preface. The defense of the nation is sustained by knowledge, cooperation, and efficiency. Valor without system leads only to sacrifice. That line, almost a mirror of Okada's wartime conclusion, marked a national transformation. Meanwhile, American officers observed with fascination how quickly Japanese instructors absorbed procedural logic. At Camp Fuji, U.S. advisors noted that Japanese trainees scored 12% higher on coordination drills than American recruits. Discipline was never the problem, infrastructure had been. The JSDF's new doctrine blended two worlds: American mechanization and Japanese precision. Field operations manuals now included both firing tables and ethical instruction. Duty to unit, responsibility to civilians, restraint in engagement. The empire had been militaristic, the republic was procedural. By 1956, Japan's reformed officer corps had produced its own manual, Tactics for Limited Defense Operations. It retained the American structure but replaced attack with preservation. It was the final conversion of mindset, from conquest to control, from spirit to system. In a quiet office at the Defense Academy, a portrait of Sadanobu Okada hung above a bookshelf. Beneath it lay a copy of the original U.S. manual seized on Guadalcanal in 1942, yellowed, annotated in red ink. The caption beneath the portrait read, "He saw the machine before we could build it." April 1957, Tokyo Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI. A meeting that looked purely economic began with a phrase no one expected from a civilian bureaucrat. "Gentlemen, efficiency is our defense." The speaker, Deputy Minister Ichiro Kono, had spent the war as a logistics officer in the Guangdong Army. Now he stood before a group of engineers and industrial planners, holding not a military report, but a translation of FM 100-5, Field Service Regulations. The pages were smudged, annotated in Japanese script. The post-war world had no use for Japanese infantry, but every use for their discipline. What had been tactical coordination in 1943 was now process control. MITI's planners began to see the logic that had beaten them: standardization, measurement, feedback. The manuals had escaped the barracks. 1958, Nagoya Toyota Motor Works. On the factory floor, Supervisor Taichi Ono observed a line of workers assembling transmissions. Each motion was timed. Errors were logged. The system was not born in Detroit, it had roots in wartime lessons. Ono's notebooks referenced a U.S. Army training manual translated by the Japanese Technical Cooperation Agency: "Every worker must be able to replace another in emergency." He adapted that principle into the Kanban method: modular, just-in-time production. No motion wasted, no stock idle. It was battlefield logistics turned into manufacturing philosophy. Former Army officers, men like Okada's former analysts, quietly filled Japan's post-war corporate ranks. At Toshiba, Hitachi, and Mitsubishi, they built scheduling systems, safety procedures, and communications chains identical to what the American manuals had described for combat. They no longer moved ammunition, they moved information. 1961, Yokosuka, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force Training Center. Commander Hiroshi Kosaka addressed a class of new midshipmen. Behind him, two maps, Midway and the Sea of Japan. "History is instruction," he said. "But instruction must be measured." He explained how American naval doctrine had reduced battle to algorithms: strike radius, sortie interval, refueling sequence. The JMSDF adopted the same logic. Every exercise, every maneuver was timed, graphed, and reviewed. Sailors were now trained like engineers. Every lesson ended with data. At the same time, civilian universities began teaching operations research, a field unknown in Japan before 1945. Keio University's first course, launched in 1956, used translated RAND manuals and military logistics case studies. The students who once would have learned swordsmanship now studied Q theory. By the early 1960s, that discipline bled into industry and government. Japan's economic ministries used war room charts to track productivity, shipping, and energy flow. The same wall boards that once plotted artillery now mapped industrial output. 1964, Tokyo Shinkansen Control Center. As the first bullet train prepared to depart, a young systems engineer briefed foreign journalists. "Every train movement is monitored by central dispatch," he explained. "Delays are unacceptable. Timing equals safety." His father had been a captain in the Imperial Army. The son had turned tactical punctuality into technological reliability. The phrase, "American-style procedural doctrine," appeared in MITI's 1965 Industrial White Paper. It credited the rise of Japan's productivity to scientific management techniques introduced by the occupation and adapted with domestic precision. The authors did not mention that those techniques originated from U.S. infantry training manuals once seized as war trophies. The echo was complete. Even Japan's educational reforms bore the same pattern. Post-war curriculums emphasized problem-solving through process and data, not obedience to authority. Teachers were retrained to measure outcomes, not merely discipline behavior. A quiet revolution in thought, efficiency as virtue, not zeal. By the late 1960s, Western economists marveled at Japan's transformation. "They have turned defeat into system," wrote The Economist in 1967. "Where the old army worshipped courage, the new nation worships precision." Inside a Defense Academy archive in Yokosuka, a researcher discovered a folder labeled Manual No. 1, Fort Benning, Georgia. The pages were brittle, still marked with Okada's notes. At the bottom of one sheet in faded pencil a final comment: "If spirit cannot command the machine, let it master the system." That became the unspoken creed of post-war Japan, a nation rebuilt on the logic it once failed to imitate. The manuals had not just reformed an army. They had rewired a civilization. October 12, 1972, Fort Benning, Georgia. The air was hot, heavy with pine and jet fuel. On a firing range named after a long-forgotten colonel, American soldiers in olive fatigues moved through an urban combat drill, squads bounding, radios crackling, M16s barking in short, timed bursts. At the edge of the range, a small delegation from Japan's ground self-defense force watched in silence. Among them was Colonel Yoshio Tanemura, once a young instructor at Camp Zama. The exercise looked familiar, not because he had seen it in an American film, but because it was his own country's reflection. The same diagrams. The same cadence. The same doctrine once captured in jungle mud 30 years before. After the demonstration, an American officer handed him a fresh copy of FM 7-10, the Rifle Company Infantry Battalion. Tanemura turned it over. The preface was unchanged from the wartime edition, except for one new line. Doctrine evolves through study, adaptation, and experience. He smiled faintly. For the Americans it was just a maxim. For Japan it was an epitaph. Backtrack 3 decades. August 1942, Guadalcanal. When Japanese troops opened the first crate of American manuals near the Matanako River, they saw neat English tables, firepower ratios, training checklists, diagrams of overlapping fields of fire. They saw a nation that treated battle like engineering. What they could not see was that those diagrams would outlive the war itself. 1975, Tokyo Defense Agency Archives. Researchers compiling the history of Japan's military reconstruction requested access to Document Series No. 12, Captured Enemy Training Materials. Inside the brown folders lay the original U.S. manuals from Rabaul, still bound with fading red twine. The archivists scanned them, annotated them in Japanese, and placed them in climate-controlled storage. In the metadata catalog, the digital entry read, Source of Post-War Doctrinal Reform. For the first time, Japan's government officially acknowledged that its self-defense forces owed their intellectual foundation to American infantry training literature captured during the Pacific War. The manuals had become relics, but also blueprints. 1979, Washington, D.C., National Defense University. At a symposium on systems thinking in modern warfare, a Japanese scholar presented a paper titled Doctrine as Infrastructure: Lessons from Japan's Post-War Transition. He projected a simple image onto the screen, a side-by-side comparison of a U.S. platoon diagram from 1942 and a JSDF team structure from 1975. Nearly identical. The audience, officers from NATO, RAND, and the Pentagon, sat in silence. When asked why Japan had adopted its former enemy's logic so completely, the scholar replied, because it worked, and because it had no ego. Meanwhile, in Japan's civilian world, the same algorithm spread far beyond military doctrine. Airline maintenance protocols, earthquake response planning, even factory shift coordination, all drew upon procedural control models that mirrored the operational charts once designed for combat. The ghost of Fort Benning had left the battlefield and entered the bloodstream of a rebuilt nation. 1982, Fort Benning Archives Infantry Museum. An American curator opened a parcel marked Returned by Government of Japan. Inside, a single weathered booklet, FM 7-10 Infantry Company in the Attack, with marginalia in Japanese brush script. A note was attached in English. Captured 1942 Rabaul. Studied 1943. Preserved 1954. Returned 1982. With respect. The curator placed it in a glass case under soft light. Visitors rarely noticed the thin red underlines beside English phrases, team coordination, supply continuity, fire discipline. But at the bottom of the final page, faint but legible, one annotation remained in Japanese. The enemy fights as one mind. To win, we must learn to think as one system. No name. No signature. But historians believe it was Okada's hand. Epilogue, Systems of Men. By the late 20th century, both nations had evolved beyond the brutal logic of industrial war. Yet their connection remained, the manual, the method, the mindset. The United States had turned doctrine into machinery, Japan had turned machinery into method. And somewhere between Fort Benning's rifle ranges and Tokyo's bullet train control rooms, the same rhythm pulsed, procedure as power, precision as survival. The manuals, once trophies of conquest, had become silent teachers. Their pages no longer smelled of oil and rain, only of ink and memory. And in that memory lived the final truth of the war both nations had fought and rebuilt from. Wars end. Systems endure.